In today's video, I'll be ranking every card, evolution, and tower troop in Clash Royale for the month of January. The meta has shifted quite a lot since we have last gotten balance changes, and also now that we have the new Rune Giant card in the game, as well as the Evolved Dark Goblin. As always, S tier is the highest rank a card can receive, which means it's very versatile, and there's a good chance it could use a nerf. A tier means the card is well above average. B tier is kind of the upper end of average, C tier is the lower end of average, D tier means the card is below average, F tier means the card is not versatile at all, and there's a high chance it could use a buff. We're going to start off with the bomber that I'll be putting in A tier, and just to note, this is the regular bomber. All the evolutions I'll be ranking at the end. It's a very cheap splash card. It's quite versatile as well because you can use it inside of heavier decks like inside of Lava Hound or Electro Giant, but it's also good inside of cheaper decks with the Goblin Drill, and it gets a lot of value. The Goblin Hut's going to be going in F tier. It's actually even worse now because the Spear Goblins got nerfed in the last set of balance changes, and it's way too vulnerable to spells, and it doesn't fit well inside of any deck. Speaking of the Spear Goblins, they're a little worse now after the nerf they got in the last set of balance changes, which is why I have them in B tier, but they're very good for getting chip damage, and they're very good inside of spell bait decks, inside of Mortar, for example, or with the Mega Knight. The Zap is going to be going in C tier. It's decent in this beatdown meta, but it's not as good compared to a lot of other small spells, but with that being said, it's pretty good inside of Lava Hound or maybe with the Giant, but the Evolve Zap is way better, and that's the main thing that people are playing, not the regular Zap. The minions are also going to be going in C tier. With how prevalent the arrows are in the meta, it's kind of understandable why they're not going to be much higher than this, but you can use them, of course, inside of Giant Graveyard or Lava Hound, and sometimes they'll get value before they die. And the arrows, of course, are going to be our first card going in S tier. They are just so versatile in so many different decks and archetypes. Of course, they're very good with the Lava Hound, the P.E.K.K.A., the Goblin Giant, so inside of heavier decks, but then in also cheaper and control decks, they're very good as well. You commonly see them in Bridge Spam, with Mortar, Recruit Spam, even some baity decks. They are just everywhere, and of course so good in this meta with all the bait in the meta that the arrows do so good against. They have such a large radius, which means they're getting so much value, especially as the match progresses and there's so many things on the board. It's basically impossible for them to not get value. The cannon is also going to be going in S tier, definitely the best building in this current meta, and I'm talking about the regular cannon, not even the evolved version. So many people are running, especially inside of cycle decks. It's very good inside of bait decks. It's very good with the Hog Rider, the Royal Hogs, the Goblin Drill, and sometimes you even see it in more expensive things as well, like with the Graveyard or even the Electro Giant. Sometimes it's just a very versatile building. It gets a lot of value defensively. It's very cheap. It's a pretty good counter to the Goblinstein as well, which is still everywhere even after the nerf, which is why it's so good. The Tesla, on the other hand, is going to be going in C tier. It's taken quite a hit ever since it has gotten a nerf, as well as the evolved Tesla, so you pretty much are only able to run it inside of Expo now. The Mortar is going to be going in B tier. This is mostly because almost no one plays the regular Mortar. Pretty much everyone is playing the evolved version, which is so much stronger, but with that being said, the regular Mortar, definitely not a bad building, gets a good amount of value defensively, and then of course you can use it on offense as well. The Barbarians are going to be going in D tier. Pretty much the only deck you could run them in for the most part is Lava Hound, but even inside of that, it's not really a requirement, so they've fallen off quite a bit. The regular Knight is going to be going in A tier. He gets a lot of value for his elixir cost. He's a great tank, very good inside of cheaper decks, like inside of Log Bait, Goblin Drill, for example, but you can also use him inside of heavier things like Graveyard as well, and he just gets a lot of value in a lot of different situations. The Minion Horde is going to be going in D tier. Of course, with how prevalent spells like the arrows are in the meta, it's no surprise that they have a really difficult time getting value, and there's not really any deck you need to use them in. Believe it or not, guys, I'm going to put the Tombstone in D tier, a little lower than I normally put it, because I feel like it keeps getting worse and worse as the meta changes. There's pretty much no spot for it in any deck now, because even inside of Lava Hound, people prefer to run the Evolved Goblin Cage over the Tombstone now, so there's not really any deck it needs to be played in. The Musketeer is going to be going in C tier. It's alright in 2.6 as well as Loon Cycle, but there's a lot better support cards you can use instead of her. The Valkyrie is also going to be going in C tier. Of course, the Evolved Valkyrie is going to be significantly better, but the regular version, typically you're just better off having the Knight instead of her, because pretty much the only thing she has is Splash, but generally, because the Knight's 1 elixir cheaper, he's going to get more value in most situations. The Goblins are going to be going in A tier. They do a lot of DPS. They get a lot of value for only 2 elixir. They're very good in like recruit spam decks. They're also going to be pretty good inside of Hog, Goblin Drill, things along those lines. They're pretty good in baity and spammy decks. The Hog Rider is going to be going in A tier. Of course, you can run things like OG 2.6, you could run Hog X NATO, and of course Hog EQ being the strongest out of those three in this meta. Very good with the cannon as well as the Gobstein. Believe it or not, guys, the mini P.E.K.K.A, even though it got a 5% damage buff, is still going in C tier because it hasn't been seen in any new decks. For the most part, you're only still seeing it inside of Sparky from time to time, and that's about it. The Fireball is going to be going in A tier. Really nice to get that direct damage instantly if you don't want to wait. So of course it's going to be very good inside of things like Expo, 2.6, Royal Giant. You could even run it in some Mortar decks, some Recruit decks. You could even fit it in something like P.E.K.K.A if you want to. A lot of different things you can use the Fireball in, and Lava Hound, of course. The Bomb Tower is going to be going in B tier. I feel like it's an alright building in this meta, especially in some cycle decks like Loon Cycle, for example, Minor Wall Breakers, or with the Goblin Drill, but of course the Cannon is going to be a better option in most matchups. The Giant's going to be going in C tier. Of course, with all the P.E.K.K.A in this current meta, it's not going to be much higher than that, but you can use it inside of Giant Graveyard if you want to, or some Giant Prince deck potentially as well. The regular Wizard's definitely going to be going in F tier. He's just so weak to spells, and it's hard to fit him inside of decks, which is why every single person running the Wizard, unless you're in mid-ladder, is using the evolved version, of course, which has a shield. The Inferno Tower is going to be going in B tier. Of course, it's going to be very good inside of bait decks, but a lot of bait players actually prefer to run the Cannon over the Inferno, because even though the Inferno is very good against things like the P.E.K.K.A as well as the Lava Hound, it's a lot worse against cycle decks where the Cannon is going to be a lot more consistent. The Rocket's going to be going in B tier with the Inferno because, of course, a lot of bait players like to run the Rocket or maybe some Expo or Goblin Drill decks, but a lot of people in this current meta, even inside of bait decks, are using the Poison as their spell of choice, or maybe even they have Log and they have Princess and the Dark Goblin and they don't even have the Rocket, so it's definitely not a requirement. The Elixir Collector is going to be going in D tier. Even though the Void got absolutely killed when it got nerfed, it still hasn't been enough to revive the Elixir Collector because of all the Earthquake in the meta, and just the meta in general has made it really difficult for people to play the card. The Barbarian Hut, of course, is going in F tier. Potentially the worst card in the whole game. It just gets no value. It's so bad against spells, and you can't pair it in any deck. The Mirror's also going to be going inside of F tier because, once again, it just doesn't really get any value. You can't really fit it in any deck. You're spending more elixir to play the same card, which in most situations isn't even worthwhile. The Rage is going in A tier, definitely one of the best small spells in the game. It pairs very well, especially inside of beatdown decks. You commonly see this card with the Evolved Goblin Giant, the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. It's very good with things like the Ram Rider as well. Just essentially anything where if it's sped up, it's even more obnoxious, you can expect to see the Rage spell in it. The Skeleton Army is going to be going in F tier. It's another card that seems to just get worse and worse as the meta keeps changing. It just doesn't really fit well in any deck. You might see it in some niche and off meta thing on mid ladder, but it's just very difficult to use overall. Spells are just too good against it. Believe it or not, guys, the Goblin Barrel is going to be going in B tier. Even though bait's in a very good spot right now, it's because of the evolved Goblin Barrel. The regular Goblin Barrel is a lot easier to deal with, which is why at the top of ladder you don't really see anyone using just the standard barrel. It's always the evolved version, so they can eventually get to that version that's significantly more powerful because you have to deal with two barrels at the same time. The Baby Dragon's going to be going in B tier. The buff has definitely helped it out a tiny bit, especially inside of graveyard decks. That's where I'm commonly seeing it again now. But with that being said, definitely not as strong as some other flying things like the Inferno Drag and some others that I'll get to. The Freeze is going to be going in C tier. The reason it's in C and not D is because I'm seeing a bit of a return of Graveyard Freeze, where of course the Freeze is absolutely incredible in that type of deck, and then you might match some off-meta Loon Freeze decks here and there as well. The Witch, guys, surprisingly is going to be going in F tier. In my opinion, her buff has done pretty much absolutely nothing because I don't really see anyone playing her even after the buff at the top of ladder. So for the most part, it's only still going to be mid-ladder menaces using her. The Prince is going to be going in B tier. He's going to be pretty decent inside of some baity and spam decks, and also you can use him with a giant if you want as well, but definitely not too OP or anything. The Archers are going to be going in D tier. Pretty much the only deck you can use them in is Expo, and of course with all the arrows in the meta, not really that surprising why they aren't that good. The balloon is going to be going in A tier. I feel like kind of like the Hog Rider, it's just such a consistent win condition no matter what the meta is. Of course, it's paired very well with the Lava Hound, but you also see it inside of Loon Cycle as well. The Giant Skeleton is going to be going in D tier. It's just such a difficult card to fit in your deck. I feel like it's just kind of clunky, kind of expensive, so it's just not really that versatile. There's not really any deck that requires to use him. The Lightning is going to be going in A tier. You commonly see this card inside of heavier decks, like with the Goblin Giant or the P.E.K.K.A, for example. Going to be a nice reset to things like the Inferno Tower, a great way of taking out the Archer Queen, as well as the Goblin Stein, which you see a lot of in this meta, making it a very consistent and solid spell. The Expo is going to be going in D tier, definitely one of the weakest win conditions in this meta because of a lot of the different tanks, like the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, the Evolved Goblin Giant, the Goblin Stein, as well as the Evolved Cannon can make it really difficult for the Expo to lock on the tower. The regular P.E.K.K.A is going to be going in A tier. I honestly don't think the regular P.E.K.K.A is super broken and needs a nerf. I think the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is still the problem, even after all the changes it has received, but the P.E.K.K.A, of course, going to pair very well with the Ram Rider, as well as the Evolved Battle Ram, or even the regular Battle Ram, if you want, and even with the Goblin Giant, a very versatile card in this meta, especially for how expensive it is. The Golem is going to be going in D tier, one of the worst win conditions in the meta as well because of how good the P.E.K.K.A is. It, of course, makes it hard for the Golem to get a lot of value, and also with the Elixir Collector being as bad as it is, kind of goes hand in hand with the Golem being bad because you commonly see them together. The Royal Giant's going to be going in C tier. I feel like the regular Royal Giant almost nobody plays. Pretty much everyone always runs the Evolved version, and it's also kind of kept in check this meta because of the P.E.K.K.A as well as the Cannon. The Three Musketeers are going to be going in F tier. I feel like they just keep getting worse and worse, and I really think they need an evolution or something because with how bad the Elixir Collector is too, they're pretty much dead completely. The Dark Prince is going to be going in B tier. It has seen a little more usage than the mini P.E.K.K.A after the buff. The Dark Prince, of course, going to be very good with the Goblin Giant. It's really nice to have that splash damage, and you can also use it with the Giant if you want as well. The Poison's going to be going in A tier. Definitely a very good medium spell in this meta, just like the Fireball. The Poison, of course, going to be very good inside of graveyard decks where you commonly see it, but there's actually some bait players running the Poison now too, which is kind of surprising. And then, of course, with the Goblin Drill, a very nice spell to have where you're dealing damage over time. The Princess is going to be going in B tier. Definitely a card you commonly see inside of bait decks. Very annoying when she's played at the bridge as well, and you could even consider her a secondary win condition. The Ice Wizard's going to be going in A tier. Ever since he has gotten that splash buff, he's even seen sometimes in decks that don't even have the Tornado, which really goes to show the impact of his buff. But of course, he's seen a lot inside of Graveyard. You could use him in Mortar, and also even in things like Ice Bow. The Fire Spirit's going to be going in B tier. Definitely not the best spirit in the game, but still very valuable. You commonly see it inside of Goblin Drill, and also you could run it in some bait decks as well. The Furnace is going to be going in F tier. It's just a very bad spawner, kind of like the Goblin Hut and the Barbarian Hut, and it's just so weak against spells, you can't really fit it in any deck, and it's just trash. The Guards are going to be going in S tier, just a fantastic defensive card. They don't get taken out by arrows, which is key for them. They're a very good counter to things like the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, and they're very versatile. You can use them in a lot of heavier things like Lava Hound, with the Evolved Goblin Giant, with the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. You can use them inside of some cheaper things as well, like with the Mortar, for example, or you could even run them inside of things like Goblin Drill. Just a fantastic card in this current meta to help counter the meta. The Miner's also going to be going in S tier. A big part of it, of course, is because of his versatility. You can run him in so many different things. Of course, heavier decks, like with the Lava Hound, with the Giant, and then, of course, cheaper things like Loon Cycle, Mortar Cycle, Miner Wall Breakers, Miner with the Mega Knight, and more. Just a great card for getting chip damage, a really solid secondary win condition. The Sparky is going to be going in C tier. It's a tad better in this current meta because of the Chef, but overall, definitely not super strong because most people running the Evolved Goblin Giant don't run the Sparky in the deck, and there's also so many resets to it, and it's fairly easy to deal with it overall. Believe it or not, guys, the regular Skeletons I'm going to put in A tier, not S tier, tier because there's more people running the guards in this current meta. But with that being said, the regular skeletons are still very good in a lot of different cycle decks. For example, of course, with the Hog Rider, you'll commonly see them inside of Expo, the Goblin Drill maybe. But the thing is, it's interesting because some people run the regular skeletons, but I would say about half of the people, even after the evolved skeletons got a nerf, are still running the evolved version, which is why I actually think the regular ones aren't S tier at the moment. The Lava Hound's going in A tier. I feel like it's a very consistent win condition no matter what the meta is, and there's a lot of different lava variations you can use. Of course, there's Lava Loon, and then you can pair it with different evolutions. Like, a lot of people like running it with the Evolved Goblin Cage, maybe the Evolved Zap, but some people might want to run the Evolved Valkyrie. So there's just a lot of different versions. Oh yeah, and also the Evolved Bomber. So you can kind of pick and choose which you want to run. Just overall, a solid tank. The Ice Spirit's going to be going in S tier. In my opinion, the best spirit in this current meta. It just gets so much value freezing things, and there's a lot of people running the regular Ice Spirit again. That's right, guys. A lot of people were running the Evolved Ice Spirit, but after the massive nerf the Evolved version has gotten, there's more people, once again, running the regular version over the Evolved version, which is why I think the standard one is an S tier. It just gets so much value for only one elixir, freezing things, allowing your unit or building more time to take out whatever it is you're targeting, and it really adds up on defense, especially when it's hitting multiple things at once. The Bowler's going to be going in B tier. I feel like it's a very situational card depending on the matchup. Sometimes it can be hard to fit it in the right deck, but it's of course very good inside of graveyard decks or in some Goblin Giant decks as well. Such a good defensive card, and then if it crosses over the bridge, sometimes you can get the Bowlers to line up on the tower as well. The Log is going to be going in S tier, kind of like the Arrows, just such a good spell in the current meta to deal with all the baity cards. And then pretty much in this current meta, a lot of the decks that don't have arrows pretty much are going to have log in them oftentimes, especially the cycle decks. Like, of course, Log Bait often has the log in it. Hog decks, Expo decks, oftentimes Mortar decks, Goblin Drill decks, and then sometimes in heavier things like with the Royal Giant as well. Just a very good spell that has really stood the test of time. It really doesn't matter what the meta is or how many nerfs it gets, it's always on top. Lumberjack got a tiny bit of a buff or a rework in the last set of balance changes. Didn't do very much. I would say it's in C tier. Definitely not very good in most things. You could use it in some bridge spam decks if you really want to, but definitely not really a requirement. The Ice Golem will also be going in C tier. It can be pretty decent inside of things like Loon Cycle or maybe 2.6, but that's kind of about it. The Mega Minion is going to be going in B tier. You might occasionally see it inside of Lava Hound decks. You could run it in some Giant decks too. Maybe also with some Gob Giant decks, but definitely the Phoenix and the Inferno Drag are going to be stronger than it. Speaking of the Inferno Drag, we're going to be putting it in A tier. This is the most common support card you see with Lava Hound oftentimes. It is just absolutely incredible against tanks. It just gets you so much value, especially if they don't have a solid reset for it. Not even just in Lava Hound decks, but also inside of some Graveyard Freeze decks, you commonly see the Inferno Drag, just a very good tank killer to have. The Graveyard's going to be going in B tier. Definitely not as broken of a win condition as it used to be. But with that being said, Splash Yard and Graveyard Freeze are in a decent spot at the moment, but there's just a lot better win conditions currently than the Graveyard, which is why I don't have it in A tier, and I feel like a lot of decks in this current meta have a pretty decent way of dealing with the Graveyard. The Elite Barbarians are going to be going in D tier. Unless you're on mid-ladder, you are not facing these things very often. They're overall pretty easy to deal with, and there's so many opportunities to get a positive elixir trade off of them if you know what you're doing. The Tornado is definitely going to be going in S tier in this meta. It always alternates between A and S, but now it's definitely in S. The small nerf the Fisherman got might have been a small indirect buff to the Tornado, because you kind of got to always pick and choose which one you want to use since they both have a similar purpose. The Tornado is very good inside of Goblin Drill decks. It's very good with the Evolved E-Drag. You can use it with the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. as well. Minor Wall Breakers. Ice Bow, Graveyard, a very versatile spell, very good for king activations, pulling things away from your win condition, you name it, definitely a solid spell currently. The Clone is going to be going in F tier, just so bad against certain spells like the arrows, the NATO, the poison. You don't even see Lava Clone anymore nowadays. It is just completely fallen off. The Electro Wizard's going to be going in C tier. It's an okay support card with the P.E.K.K.A maybe or some Goblin Giant decks, but there's overall going to be way better options than it. The Goblin Gang is going to be going in A tier. The Spear Goblin nerf has made it slightly worse, which is why I don't have it in S tier anymore. But with that being said, absolutely incredible inside of bait decks, and not even just bait decks, just spam decks in general, because it pairs very well with the Royal Recruits in that Royal Recruits bait deck. It's also very good inside of Mortar as well, a very, very solid support card. This might surprise you guys, but the regular Dark Goblin is going to be going in B tier. Currently, almost everyone running the Dark Goblin is running the evolved version, and the regular one is a lot easier to deal with, and I don't really think it's that oppressive anymore. And there's even a lot of bait decks that don't even use the Dark Goblin in it. They prefer to have the Princess and maybe some other things. The Battle Ram's going to be going in C tier. It has made a little bit of a comeback recently with the rise of the Evolved Battle Ram, but there's a lot of people just running the standard one now too occasionally, especially with the P.E.K.K.A or in some other bridge spam decks too. The Executioner is going to be going in D tier. Pretty much the only deck you're going to see him in is going to be Hog X NATO, but that overall is a pretty off-meta deck, which is why I don't think he's that high. The regular bats are going to be going in C tier. I feel like the main people running the bats are definitely running the evolved version, so the standard ones definitely don't get as much playtime, but you can use them in some baity decks if you want to, like maybe with the Mega Knight or inside of minor wall breakers, but typically everyone has the evolved version. The Heal Spirit's going to be going in D tier. Pretty much you're only going to see this in off-meta Sparky decks, and that's kind of about it. The Bandit is definitely going to be going in A tier, an absolutely incredible support card in this current meta, especially with how good the P.E.K.K.A is. Probably not that surprising. She pairs very well with both the Evolved Battle Ram as well as the Ram Rider, which are some of the strongest win conditions currently, and she can be very annoying to deal with if you don't have the right cards in cycle. The Night Witch is going to be going in D tier. She's definitely in a rough spot in this current meta with how bad Golem is, and also Giant Graveyard isn't really in the best spot either, so it's kind of not that surprising. The Skeleton Barrel is going to go up to B tier. It's definitely a lot better now because of that Recruit spam deck, which the Skeleton Barrel pairs so well in, and also that death damage buff has helped it a tiny bit too. The Flying Machine's also going to be going in B tier. It has made a return as well because of how good it is inside of Lava Hound. There's a lot of people running Lava Flying Machine again with the Evolved Goblin Cage. The Cannon card's going to be going in A tier. That nerf they gave it has definitely reduced its strength a little bit. It's slightly more manageable to deal with. There's less of a chance now it's going to lock on your tower, which is why I don't think it's S tier anymore. That nerf it got, I think, was pretty good. The Mega Knight's going to be going in C tier. Honestly, in my opinion, it's one of the most balanced cards in the game. I know it's very hated, but especially the regular version, definitely not that challenging to deal with, especially with how good the P.E.K.K.A is in the meta. It's not really in the best spot. The Zappies are going to be going in D tier. You could run them in some off-meta recruit deck if you want, but overall, they are pretty weak and they've been bad for such a long time. The Barbarian Barrel is going to be going in A tier, a very solid small spell, definitely not as good as the Log though currently. Barb Barrel typically seen inside a beatdown deck, so it's going to be very good with the Graveyard, for example, Electro Giant, Recruits, things along those lines. Really good to get that Barbarian that can help you defensively sometimes, or you can get a little bit of a counter push out of it as well. The Hunter's going to be going in C tier. That small buff it got hasn't helped it that much because for the most part, the only deck you're going to be able to run it in is Royal Giant. The Royal Ghost is going to be going in A tier, kind of the same as the Bandit. Oftentimes you see the Bandit and the Ghost in the same deck. They're both great inside of bridge spam decks with the P.E.K.K.A, as well as some other bridge spam decks without the P.E.K.K.A, like the Evolved Battle Ram, for example. It's just really nice to get that invisibility and splash, getting you a lot of value in a lot of different situations. It's also very good with the Royal Giant, too. The Magic Archer is going to be going in B tier. He has made a tiny bit of a comeback recently because he's been being played a lot again inside of minor wall breakers after the Evolved Wall Breaker buff. It's kind of been an indirect buff to the Magic Archer. The Rascals are going to be going in D tier. You pretty much only see them in some off-meta bait decks, but most bait decks definitely do not run them. The Snowball is going to be going in C tier. The main deck you see it in is Loon Cycle and Giant Graveyard, but Giant Graveyard isn't really that great in the meta, so I don't really think the Snowball's in the best spot currently. The regular recruits are going to be going in D tier. This might be a little bit controversial, but I honestly think the standard version is pretty bad. The Evolve recruits is what everyone is playing. No one really runs the regular version, and because they're only one cycle, people are just trying to cycle the regular recruits as quick as possible to get to those broken Evolve ones a lot quicker. The Royal Hogs, guys, I'm actually going to have in B tier. They are not one of the strongest win conditions in the meta anymore, and maybe that isn't super surprising because of the Evolve Skeleton nerf, as well as the Evolve Ice Spirit deck has definitely hit the Royal Hog cycle deck really hard, and it's definitely not as broken as it was a month ago. The regular Goblin Giant's going to be going in C tier. The Evolve version is significantly better, and it's pretty much the same thing as the recruits. There's not really anyone running the regular Goblin Giant. It's always the Evolve version spawning those goblins that's so much more obnoxious to deal with. And technically speaking, the Spear Goblin nerf is a small nerf to the Goblin Giant. The regular Electro Drag is going to be going in D tier. It's kind of the same thing. A lot of the standard cards for some of the evolutions really suck. There's so much lightning in the meta. The regular version is just so much easier to deal with, so people are just playing it to eventually get to that evolved version, which is why no one uses the regular one for the most part. The Ramrider is going to be joining the Royal Hogs in B tier. In my opinion, after the small damage nerf that the Ramrider got in the last set of balance changes, it has definitely toned her down quite a bit, and she's no longer one of the strongest win conditions in the meta, kind of like the Royal Hogs. The regular wall breakers are going in B tier. They're a little bit better. I think the Evolve wall breaker buff has kind of reminded people how good the regular wall breakers are, because there's a lot of people using the standard ones and not even the Evolve version, because in that recruit spam deck, the regular wall breakers are commonly used, and sometimes not the Evolve version if people want to use things like the Evolve Firecracker, for example, instead. The Earthquake is going to be going in A tier, definitely one of the best spells in this current meta. Of course, inside of Hog EQ, you see it all the time, but also inside of Royal Hog Cycle, it of course is going to be the spell of choice to help you break through the cannon that everyone is running. The regular Goblin Cage is going to be going in C tier. Once again, this is another one of those cards where it's like people are only playing it to get to that evolution. And of course, that Evo Cage, significantly better than the regular one because it's just way better against tanks and gets you so much value defensively. The regular one is okay though, and some people do sometimes run the regular one, maybe inside of a recruit deck, for example, or maybe some sort of balloon deck. The Fisherman's going to be going in A tier. That small nerf he has gotten definitely seemed to make him a little bit worse, but he's still very, very strong in most situations. You commonly see the Fisherman, of course, with the Royal Giant, but also with the Evolved Goblin Giant as well. It's a very commonly seen support card, so still a way above average card even after the nerf he got. The Elixir Golem is going to be going in C tier. I feel like it's made a tiny bit of a comeback. That's mostly because of the Evolved E-Drag, though, in my opinion. He's still for sure slightly below average win condition, but definitely not as bad as he was. The Healer, though, on the other hand, is going in F tier because pretty much she's not a requirement in any deck. Pretty much all the E-Golem decks you see don't run the Healer in them, so she's pretty much useless in most decks. The Firecracker is going to be going in B tier. Pretty much the only thing keeping her from being in A tier is all the arrows in this meta, because the Firecracker is very good inside of Hog Cycle, where you commonly see her in that Gobstein Hog deck, and then of course also in Recruit Spam, the Firecracker is commonly seen as well, making her a solid support card, but because of the King activation, she's limited in the type of decks you can use her in, and also arrows kill her easily. The Delivery is going to be going in B tier. It was in A before, but because of the Royal Hog Cycle deck isn't as prevalent anymore, that means the Delivery is a bit worse as well, putting it around average currently in strength. The Skeleton Dragons are going to be going in A tier, a very solid support card in this current meta, especially inside of Lava Hound decks, but they're also very good in Mortar as well. The splash damage they deal is nice, and the fact that you can split them too gives you a lot of opportunities for them to get value. The Electro Spirit's going to be going in A tier, not quite as good as the Ice Spirit in my opinion, but any cycle deck that doesn't have the Ice Spirit oftentimes has the E-Spirit in it, so that often can be things like Expo or Royal Giant decks where you don't have to worry about the king activation as much. It, of course, is going to be very, very solid in those. Surprisingly, guys, after the Electro Giant buff, where its sight range basically was reduced, so now it can't get pulled all the way across the map, wasn't as big of a buff as people maybe thought, but of course a big part of that is probably because of how good the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is, which of course is a tremendously good counter to it, which definitely has kept the E-Giant in check even after the buff he got. The Mother Witch is going to be going in D tier. She's just overall been a pretty bad support card recently. There's not really any deck you need to run her in, but you could run her in some Sparky deck if you want. The regular Goblin Drill is going to be going in B tier. Funny enough, it's actually being used about as much as the evolved version. There's a lot of people running the regular version again, but I think overall it's definitely not as OP as it was, because there's a lot of other win conditions that are just, quite frankly, a lot stronger than the drill, and the drill has a lot of weaknesses, like it's really lacking, especially against a lot of air decks, which a lot of people are playing currently. The Golden Knight, I'm going to put in F tier. I honestly think he's the worst champion in the game by a good bit, which is why I have him in F, because I really would like to see him get a buff, because he has really been lacking for such a long time. The Archer Queen, on the other hand, is going to be going in A tier. She's definitely one of the best champions in the game, only behind the Goblinstein, but she's very good, of course, in that Royal Hog Cycle deck. But then also, there's some Bridge Spam decks that have been trending recently with the Evolved Battle Ram that she is very good in as well. The Skeleton King is going to be going in B tier. Same with the Mighty Miner. I feel like the Skelly King has made a little bit of a comeback after the small nerf that the Goblinstein has gotten. We're seeing him in some graveyard decks and inside of Mortar Bait. And then the Mighty Miner, of course, very good sometimes with the Hog Rider as well as the Recruit Spam deck. The Monk is going to be going in D tier. I feel like pretty much the only deck that the Monk is good in is Royal Giant, and even in Royal Giant, there's a lot of times where people prefer not using the Monk, and they don't even have a champion inside of the Royal Giant deck. And then the Little Prince, of course, after all the nerfs he has gotten, he is finally one of the worst champions in the game as well, and he's joining the Monk inside of D tier because there's not really any deck where he's a requirement in. The Phoenix is going to be going in A tier, of course, a very good card inside of Royal Giant, but then it's in some other heavier things as well, like maybe the Giant, the Lava Hound, or P.E.K.K.A decks. The Void is going to be going in F tier. They absolutely killed it with that 32% damage nerf, and there's no sign of it coming back anytime soon unless they decide to give it a buff. It is absolute trash now. The Goblin Demolisher got a small buff in the last set of balance changes. Still D tier, in my opinion. The Goblin Curse is also going in D tier. The Goblin Machine is also going in D tier. And the Bush is also going in D tier. All of these cards are just pretty bad. They're all going in D tier. The Bush has never been that great. The Goblin Machine isn't F tier anymore after the buff it has gotten. It's in some niche decks like P.E.K.K.A, for example. I'm seeing it sometimes. And then the Curse is okay in some bait decks. And the Demolisher, it's okay in some like Bridge Spam decks, but none of these things are really a requirement in any deck. But the Goblinstein, on the other hand, is going in S tier. The nerf it got where the Doctor now is able to die to the poison has proven to be not enough of a nerf because it is way too versatile. You can run it in some cycle decks, like with the Hog Rider, for example. You can run it in baity decks if you really want to. You can run it in control decks as well if you want, like with the Graveyard. And then, of course, heavier decks, like with the P.E.K.K.A and the Goblin Giant. You name it. Just overall a very solid card. I think it's just way too consistent, and I just think it fits in too many decks, and it's just a bit too strong, so it could definitely use another very small nerf in my opinion. But I would say it's almost at the point where it's somewhat balanced if it just gets something else, but it's still way too good, I think, and it's by far the best champion in the game. There's even a pretty big difference between it and the Archer Queen, I would say. The Rune Giant is going to be going in F tier. In my opinion, she's really, really bad, and as more and more time has gone on, she's pretty much proven to fit in pretty much zero deck in the game, which is interesting because at first people thought she was going to be broken with the Hunter and the Firecracker, for example. She's way too situational, though, and I feel like as the match goes on, she just gets worse and worse as there's more things going on, especially because she can only enhance 2 things at once. So it's just very, very difficult to use her, and she's super weak on her own as well. As for the tower troops, the Chef, in my opinion, is the best tower troop in the game currently. He's kind of the reasoning behind the evolved P.E.K.K.A, as well as the evolved Goblin Giant being even stronger than they are, and you could even say the Goblin Stein and the Lava. That's the case as well. He has made beatdown absolutely insane currently in this meta. He alone has shifted the meta so much along with the Goblin Stein, and most people are asking for him to get a very, very small nerf. Now, the Princess Tower, though, comes at a close second. In my opinion, she is an A tier, and then what's interesting is the Cannoneer as well as the Duchess actually are both in B tier. There's a very big difference, I would say, between the Princess Tower, the Cannoneer, and the Duchess. I would say the Chef is only slightly better than the Princess Tower, but then the Princess Tower is like noticeably better than the Cannoneer, as well as the Duchess. Almost so much so I almost want to go like this, because I'm seeing way more Princess Tower than these two, but these two are around similar strength. The Cannoneer, surprisingly, hasn't been as good in this meta. There's been less people running Mortar Cannoneer, and the Duchess has been slightly better after the buff she's received, so some people are using her in some Goblin Giant decks or some bait decks on and off again. So the Cannoneer and the Duchess have similar usage rate, but they're definitely lacking behind the Princess Tower by quite a lot. And I can't decide between the two which is better, but the Princess Tower, definitely the second best, and the Chef the best in my opinion. Princess Tower, you guys already know the stats, but I would say these two pretty far behind. So that is my ranking for the cards as well as the tower troops. Now we'll get into the evolutions. Alright guys, now for the evolutions. In my opinion, the Evolved Snowball is the worst evolution in the game. There's not many decks it fits well in. There's hardly any times where it's getting more value than the regular Snowball. It's just hard to make it work, and it's proven to be one of the worst evolutions even though it's new. The Evolved Tesla has just never been the same ever since its Death Shockwave has been removed. It has been a very, very bad building evolution, which is why pretty much almost no one runs it anymore. The Evolved Musketeer, even though she's got a couple buffs to help her out, she's proven to be pretty much unusable outside of Loon Cycle, which is why she's not that good. The Evolved Barbarians, surprisingly, aren't the worst evolution in the game anymore, because they've been making a return inside of Bridge Spam decks and also occasionally inside of Lava Hound, but overall they're pretty weak compared to a lot of the other evolutions. The Evolved Wizard, pretty bad ever since the shield nerf came into effect, where they nerfed its shield as well as the knockback he has done. He's been a lot worse, but you can still use him from time to time if you want. The Evolved Goblin Drill, not really that great. There's a lot of people that actually prefer to run the regular Goblin Drill and not even use the Evolved version, because the Evolved version no longer gets death damage every single time, making it a lot easier to deal with. The Evolved Archers, of course, are not going to be super great when arrows are as prevalent as they are in the meta, but they can be decent inside of Expo and Giant Graveyard if you want. The Evolved Royal Giant, not going to be super duper OP with his ability, especially when he's matching a building or a P.E.K.K.A. It's not really doing anything, so the Evolved RG definitely not as good as it normally is at this point in time. The Evolved Mortar, surprisingly, is way worse in this current meta. There's way less people using it, and I just think it's because of the meta shift. I don't know what it's been, but it's possible because of all the tanks right now and also the Evolved Cannon being as good as it is. It has just made the Evolved Mortar a lot worse because there's just been a lot less of it for whatever reason. The Evolved Mega Knight, probably not that surprising with how good the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. is, so that's why it's as bad as it is, because if you have the option between the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. and Evolved Mega Knight, what you use, it's kind of a no-brainer that you're going to go with the P.E.K.K.A. The Evolved E-Drag is a lot worse. A lot of people didn't expect it, but there's way less people using it after the nerf it got. It's just not dealing as much damage anymore, and as long as you're able to take it out quickly, it just simply doesn't get as much value as it used to. It's definitely easier to manage. The Evolved Battle Ram is decent inside of some Bridge Spam decks, not as good as it was a month ago when it was everywhere with that Gobstein deck, but now there's a lot of people running it with the Archer Queen. Now that the Evolved Bomber only deals 1 bounce, definitely a lot easier to deal with it, and it's no longer as broken anymore, but definitely still viable, especially inside of heavier decks, but it's harder to run inside of Cycle now for sure. The Evolved Knight definitely toned down a lot after all the nerfs he's gotten. He's finally a more average evolution now. Of course, going to be very good inside of Graveyard and maybe inside of Bait, but definitely not viable in every single deck anymore, and he's still a solid tank. The Evolved Cage going to be absolutely incredible, especially inside of Lava Hound decks and inside of Recruits, but it's kind of situational because against air decks and against cycle decks, it's not really doing anything, but against tanks, of course, it's very good. The Evolved Royal Recruits are a lot easier to deal with after the nerf they got, where their charge isn't as frequent anymore. It makes them easier to deal with, and I would say they're a more balanced evolution overall now. The evolved Firecracker are going to be very good with the Hog Rider as well as with the recruits, but of course because of arrows, there is going to be a way that you're going to be able to stop her easily for a nice even trade. The evolved Dark Goblin wasn't as good as me and other people thought it was. It's proven to be only good inside of some bait decks, and because of all the log and arrows in the meta, it's kind of the same story as the Firecracker, for example, in a lot of the other baity cards. It definitely helps keep it in check, and it's not as broken as you would expect. The evolved Ice Spirit has also proven to be a little different than what I expected. I thought it was going to be a lot worse after the nerf it has gotten, but it has proven to be still a very strong evolution and potentially even above average, even though it only freezes things twice now. Because it's dealing extra damage, it kind of helps compensate for that nerf it got, and it's not completely dead, and it's still used in a lot of cycle decks more than you would expect. The evolved Zap, of course, going to be very good inside of beatdown decks. Even though it's only zapping things twice now instead of 3 times, it wasn't dead like a lot of people expected it to be. It's very good with the P.E.K.K.A. It's very good with the Goblin Giant, very good with the Lava Hound, so perhaps it's not that surprising. The evolved Wall Breaker's way better after that death damage buff they've gotten. One of the best evolutions in the game now. You can even use them defensively now. They just explode, dealing a massive amount of damage. The evolved Goblin Barrel went from S tier to A tier. Even though you can tell where the fake one is, it oftentimes doesn't matter, especially in double and triple elixir where there's so much going on, you can't even pay attention to where the real one and the fake one is. And even if you can, sometimes it doesn't even matter depending on what your cycle is. So it ended up being a very small nerf to it. The evolved Cannon, 10% more bomb damage for each one of the bombs, a very significant buff, has made it be used a lot more, especially inside of graveyard decks. The evolved Cannon is used in, as well as Hog and bait decks. It is a very, very good evolution. The evolved Bat's going to be very good inside of mortar bait. They're also very good with the Goblin Giant as well. You can run them in some other baity decks. That heal aspect makes them very, very solid, and they're, I feel like, a very underrated evolution. They're used so much, and they might not seem strong, but in certain matchups and situations, they can be very annoying. The evolved Skeletons, this is potentially the most surprising one to a lot of people. Even though there's only 3 instead of 4, I thought they were going to be a lot worse, but they have proven to still be one of the best evolutions in the game. Sure, they're not as broken, and absolutely everyone is running them, like half the people in the top 100 anymore, but there's still a good chunk of people using them, especially inside of cycle decks. And even though you can't split them, sending 2 in one lane, 2 in the other, in a lot of different decks and situations, that doesn't matter. And if you don't have the proper spell for them, they can get infinite value. But of course, there are some times where they die now, where they didn't before, which is why they're no longer an S tier, and they're probably in a pretty decent spot at this point in time. The evolved Valkyrie I have in S tier. This might be a bit surprising, but there has been so many people using her recently, and I think a big part of the reason for this is because she's proven to be much better than the evolved Knight currently. So there's a lot of people running the evolved Valkyrie instead of the evolved Knight, especially inside of bait decks. She's a lot better against bait as well as the recruits. She's very good in lava too. Lava evolved Valk is such a strong combination, especially defensively. You can use her in Hog X, NATO if you want to, in graveyard and things along those lines. Now, the evolved P.E.K.K.A. is still S tier. Even after the rework she has gotten, it is proven to hardly make a difference because against beatdown decks, sorry, I had a cough. Against beatdown decks, she's better. And the evolved P.E.K.K.A. is already really good against beatdown, so she's even better against beatdown, making it almost impossible for beatdown decks to beat her. And then against like control decks, she's roughly the same, because she's getting around the same amount of heal, but then she's worse against cycle. So it's very situational. It just made it more situational and dependent on the matchup. So basically, it was a broken card, and it essentially still stays broken, and there's not much of a difference. Clearly, it needs something else. I think it shouldn't heal when it kills buildings. I feel like that doesn't make any sense, so that could be a decent nerf to the evolved P.E.K.K.A. personally. I would say that's good. And then the evolved Goblin Giant, I think, is the best evolution in the game because it pairs so well with the Chef. The fact that you level up the evolved Goblin Giant, not only is the Goblin Giant stronger, it has more health, deals more damage, also the Spear Goblins get leveled up as well, and then the Goblins, it spawns, so it's literally getting 3 buffs, so potentially it's not even that surprising why it's as good as it is. It also pairs very well with a lot of the other evolutions, particularly the evolved P.E.K.K.A. The evolved Goblin Giant, evolved P.E.K.K.A. Such a broken combination. It also goes very well with the evolved Zap. the evolved bats as well. So many different kinds of combinations you can do with it, and definitely a very, very strong evolution. Needs a nerf at the moment for sure. I don't know if the evolved Valkyrie needs a nerf. It's just, I think, good in this particular meta, but for sure the evolved Gob Giant, the evolved P.E.K.K.A definitely needs something. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you guys are not subscribed already. These take me a while to make, so I appreciate all the support. And thanks again until next time, guys. And you can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game.